morning, everybody, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist
Good morning.
Fellowship of Pottstown. We here at the UUFP, as we lovingly call it, have been a liberal religious voice of Pottstown for more than 50 years. In fact, this fall, we're going to be celebrating our 55th birthday. We believe that every person matters, and diversity is a gift. And we have come from different backgrounds for different reasons, but we are all here, or virtually here, because we have made a choice to join this fellowship family for the morning. Services vary from week to week. We have different speakers, and you will hear a variety of voices, some of whom you will agree with more than others. So we invite you to attend a few Sundays to kind of get a flavor of what we're about. But no matter what, every Sunday, we hope to touch your spirit, your heart, and your mind. So whoever you are, wherever you come from, whomever you love, we are glad to have you here with us today. If it's your first time here, and you haven't done so already, please sign our book so we can send you our newsletter, The Sojourner. And of course, afterwards, we have coffee hour back in the social hall. And before I forget, I'm Mary Ryan, and I'm your service host this morning. Carly Shell, look, you can see her bun over there, is our pianist. And Emily Quarles-Maurer, with an assist from Rick Dusky on the phone, is handling our tech duties. So if anybody has any announcements, would they like to step forward? This mic, I can't remember if I tested it. I don't think I did. But please come forward and make your announcement.
I'm Kay. Next week, June 5th, Senator Katie Luth is going to be here to talk about Go 100 PA. It's how to make, it's a bill that she is trying to get through legislature in Harrisburg to get 100% renewable energy by 2050. So we're hoping that everybody can turn out for that. And we're working hard on it, right, Judy? So it should be a really good program. We want to fill this hall. Okay, thanks.
Doesn't say it up there, but somewhere we used to have a sign. Fire marshal says we can get 110. So no more announcements. Okay, hopefully everybody's phones are on silent, and we'll hit the chimes to call us together. Alan, pretty please, if you would like the chalice lighting. Our chalice lighting this morning is called Afraid of the Dark by Andrew Bakula, and it's from the back of the hymnal. Inside, no, what is it? I think I found it on the web. I apologize. In sightless night, terrors draw near, nameless fears of talent and tooth. Hopelessness yawns before us, an abyss, alone and unknown in the gloom, longing for the dawn. O sacred flame blaze forth, wisdom brought to light. To life, guide us with the hope of light of hope, the warmth of love, the beacon of purpose and meaning, because we are all afraid of the dark. Let there be light. Thank you, Alan. And they've changed several times since then because they were just getting a little too political, maybe a lot. They shouldn't have been, but they were. And so was most of the national discourse, since that has been political as well, even though it shouldn't be. The subject of the safety of our population, especially our children, should never be political. And since I'm not supposed to be political up here, I decided to use opening words number 429 from our hymnal by William S. Schultz. Come into this place of peace and let it silence your spirit. Come into this place of memory and let its history form your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and power and let its vision change your heart. And now, since this is Memorial Day weekend, we're going to have a moment of silence for not only the victims of Buffalo and Uvalde, but for all of our soldiers lost in war. Thank you, Carly. Now, the children, we come upstairs, up front here, and you can grab a mat so you don't have to sit on the floor. And Miranda will read a story. You can. Hello. I didn't know you were here. Wonderful, we have three now. This is good. I'm going to start right in the middle of this book. It's a book about a panda that is, you do? That's good. I do too. And this panda is, of course, a pretend panda because he can talk. So, and he has three friends. Michael, well, he has more than that. He has Michael and and Carl, and then the sister, and we'll find out her name. And Carl is the youngest of the three friends, the three young friends, and he's kind of upset on this day. And he's visiting with Stillwater, that's the name of the panda. Michael says, I couldn't bring stuff over to go swimming. I'm mad at Michael. He's always telling me what to do. So I brought everything to
he was gonna bring toys to go in the pool, sorry. So he's really mad at his brother. Said Stillwater, it's a little pool. I don't know if all those things will fit. Let's see, Carl said. Let's see, said Stillwater. Stillwater looked at the pool. The things can't go swimming, but we can, he said. I brought too much stuff, said Carl. That's okay, said Stillwater. I'll help you carry it home later. Actually, Stillwater said we can't go swimming because there's not enough space because we brought too many toys. Okay, that makes more sense. Why does Michael always have to tell me what to do? Carl said. If he were here, I would climb up really high and jump on him like this and do a big smash like this. Later, Carl and Stillwater had tea. Carl said, Stillwater, you spent the whole day being angry with Michael. Did you notice, though, how much fun we had? Carl watched the steam rise from his cup of tea. I'm sorry I brought all this stuff, Carl said. You don't need to be sorry, said Stillwater. Right now, you need to carry. Hold on tight, and I will tell you a story. So, Carl and Stillwater are carrying all the stuff back home to Carl's house, but Stillwater really likes to tell stories. The story comes from Asia, and it's called A Heavy Load. Two traveling monks reached a town where there was a young woman waiting to step out of her sedan chair. The rain had made deep puddles, and she couldn't step across without spoiling her silken robes. She stood there looking very cross and impatient. She was scolding her attendants. They had nowhere to place the packages they hoped for her, so they couldn't help her cross the puddle. The younger monk noticed the woman and said nothing and walked by. The older monk quickly picked her up and put her on his back and transported her across the water and put her down on the other side. She didn't even thank the older monk. She just shoved him out of the way and hugged him. She left. Oh, here. So Stillwater continues his story. He says, as they continued on their way, the young monk was brooding and preoccupied. After several hours, unable to hold his silence, he spoke up. That woman back there, she is very selfish and rude, but you picked her up on your back and carried her. Then she didn't even thank you. The older monk said, I set the woman down hours ago. The older monk replied, why are you still carrying her? You didn't even invite her. Are you still carrying her? He's saying, you're still thinking about this, and it's ruining your day. I set her down. I helped her, and then I set her down. And I'm having a good day. Do you think you've carried it long enough? Asked Stillwater. Yes, said Carl. Good, said Stillwater. I want to make sure I didn't skip it. And this is how Addie, Michael, Carl, and Stillwater became friends. Well, Stillwater he arrived that morning on a train. So you can see that what Stillwater is saying is that Carl needed to forget about that problem and not let it spoil his day. Just like the two monks in the story, the one that couldn't forget how rude the woman was. He said, it's just better to get that. Let's go on our way. Don't spend the whole day thinking about something that upset you. That's what I like about Stillwater. He gives you a way to think of things in a different way from the way you have. let's go. Bring your mats with you. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, John, don't sit down. Okay. One of the reasons the UUFP has been able to stay a presence in Pottstown for 55 years is through the generosity of its members and friends. Those of us who have been here for a while know that it was designed and built by members. So in that spirit, we're going to pass the basket to help keep the lights on. If you're a guest, don't worry about it. We're just happy to have you here. And this picture that I have up, and in case people, I don't know what's out on the web, but we did change things. This is the service that was going to be last week, but it's about the endurance expedition over to Shackleton, and it's part 2. And this picture is what happens when it's snowing and your lens hood went overboard. There was snow on it, there's spots on the lens, it was a whole lot of fun. But it does give you a good idea when I talk about them being out on the ice in the snow and getting all wet of what they were going through. Got some really great pictures. So, thank you for your generosity. And Emily, sorry. Carly will now play Wearing of the Green, because what we're doing is we're trying for the most part here to play music that they listened to or that was contemporary to their time. And the voyage was 14 through into 1960. Okay, and just unless otherwise stated, I took these pictures. Now that we're out on YouTube, we have to kind of be careful with crediting. So when we last left the Endurance crew, the men of the Imperial, I suppose I'll recap because there are a couple of folks who aren't here. It's an expedition that had left. Ernest Shackleton had put together the money. They had gone, the plan was to walk across Antarctica via the South Pole. They didn't even get there. The ice in the Weddell Sea trapped them, and then it crushed their boat and sank it after several months. I believe, what was the date that the ice, I think they got stuck in January, don't quote me exactly, about January 1915, somewhere in there. And it finally sank in October, or November. When we left the Endurance crew, the men of the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition, under the leadership of Sir Ernest Shackleton, it was November 21st, 1915, and they had just watched her lose her battle with the ice. And just a reminder, those are the folks who were on board. They had abandoned her 25 days before, on October 27th, and she had put up a valiant fight, but now she was gone for good. They could no longer go back to see what else they could salvage to use on their own on the ice. They were now alone with their last connection to the outside world at the bottom of the sea. It's a time where hope could have given way to despair, but it didn't. They had their tasks and plans for getting back to civilization. The endurance story isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of people bonding together and working as a team to make sure that they do survive this. And the amount of optimism shown throughout is amazing. In the book by Alfred Lansing that I read from last time, he had access to both their diaries and to many of the men to interview them. And in his diary, the expedition surgeon, Dr. Alexander Macklin, wrote, "Really, this sort of life has its attractions. I read somewhere that all a man needs to be happy is a full stomach and warmth, and I began to think it is nearly true. No worries, no trains, no letters to answer, no collars to wear. But I wonder which of us would not jump at the chance to change it all tomorrow." The keys to making it back to civilization, in addition to their skill and determination, would be the winds and the current and how it affected the ice. Would they take them in the direction they had to go, north? Or would they combine to send them back south? All civilization and all hope for rescue lay hundreds of miles to the north. It's late November, and since we're in the southern hemisphere, it's summer and the days are long. But the summer isn't melting that ice very much. The Weddell Sea is notorious for staying frozen, and even today, refusing to give way to even the most powerful icebreakers, except maybe military ones, and I don't know if they even try. But they were prepared for when the ice opened up and they could head out to sea. Carpenter Harry McNeish had been able to use wood from Endurance to reinforce and build up the sides of the 3 lifeboats. Leaders were assigned to them. Shackleton would command the James Caird, Frank Worsley, the Endurance, a captain of the Endurance would helm the Dudley Docker, and navigator Hubert Hudson would command the Stancomb Wills. They were really, originally, when they first got off the Endurance, they only planned on taking 2 of the lifeboats. But since Endurance stayed up a lot longer than they thought, they were able to go back and get the 3rd one. Worsley suggested, and Shackleton agreed, and they named their new home Ocean Camp. They had been on it for nearly a month, and it was a good solid floe, probably around 2 years old, about half mile in diameter, and 10 feet of solid ice, with 5 more feet of snow on top of that. They kept busy making sure the lifeboats, one of which you can see visible in the background over Shackleton's left shoulder, were packed and organized and just so they were ready to go. They practiced a test launching for when the ice broke. How fast could they gather everything that they needed to gather and go? But they were running out of things to do. They've gotten pretty good at this for now. They were prepared, but the ice was not cooperating and remained packed together as always. The winds and the current were moving this huge mass that you couldn't see the end of anywhere, about 2 miles a day. Incremental progress that could literally be reversed in hours should the winds and the current decide to move in the other direction. For example, one day they were all excited, they crossed the 67th parallel, only to go backward the next day. And since it's summer, the snow is melting. You know how miserable deep snow and slush is? Well, that's what they were dealing with. But the ice itself was holding strong. And they might get something where they would spread a little bit, maybe 20 feet, and then they would close right back up. It wasn't enough to be able to get the lifeboats out. And with little to do, things were getting quite dull. And they couldn't exercise the dogs very much because they could run around a little circle, but that was about it. The old saying is that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Of course, it's not the idle hands that are the problem, it's the idle minds that go with it. There's time to spend contemplating the situation they were in. It caused tensions to rise and Shackleton to worry. His greatest fear was that the men would become demoralized and the team that he had worked so hard to build would break apart. On December 19th, he wrote in his diary that he was thinking of starting out for the west the next day to start moving across the ice. And he informed the men of the decision. Worsley and First Officer Lionel Greenstreet thought it was a lousy idea. With Greenstreet writing, the boss seems keen to try to strike westward as we don't make headway as we are. That will mean traveling light and taking only 2 boats at the most, and leaving a lot of provisions behind. As far as I've seen, the going will be awful. Everything being in a state of softness, far worse than when we left the ship. I sincerely hope you will give up the idea directly. Dr. Macklin, however, really liked the idea, because at the rate they were moving, they wouldn't be able to reach the latitude of Paulette Island, their hoped-for destination, until the end of March. So that's what? December, January, February, 4 months away. And even then, they wouldn't be able to be sure that they were going to be able to launch their boats. And Paulette Island and the little arrow I have there, that's my best rough guess based on comparing this map to other maps. But it's in that general vicinity. And Paulette Island was picked because previous expeditions had thought, oh, it'll be a good place, we can have some stores just in case. So they loaded up the sledges with supplies and prepared to move out on December 23rd. And since they were going to be walking and moving and really working hard over Christmas, Shackleton said they could eat as much as they wanted for their celebration because they were going to have to leave a lot of the food behind. And while it's a counterintuitive move, the absolute preparedness had cost some prior expeditions their lives because they couldn't move fast enough to get through. And knowing that this being the case, they did have the advantage of knowing what had happened to other folks. They sacrificed for speed, knowing that when the ice broke up, they were going to have to move and move quickly. They had what they called a gorgie, and they ate for about a day. To quote Greenstreet, everybody finishing up feeling full as a tick. They were awakened at 3:30 the next morning and on their way an hour later. So they had gotten very good at packing up. The entire group was needed to get the James Caird over the open water around their floe. And I don't quite understand, it's never fully explained how they actually got over the little bits of water. Maybe they were close enough they could jump and then push, I don't know. But half of them, after they got the James Caird went over, half went back for the Dudley Dock. And the rest tried to hack their way through a high-pressure ridge, which you could see when we had the Endurance in the background, those ridges where the snow has been pushed together when the floe slammed together. And they couldn't push or pull these small boats over that ridge. Once again, they left the stand-cone wheels behind. This is a picture by Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer. And the smaller mounds of snow, I think, kind of represent what the ridges would look like, except the ridges were much higher. Those would be tough to get over, but the bigger ones were close to impossible. After breakfast, they harnessed the dog teams and pulled the sledges, laden with equipment and stores they would carry, and brought them to the boats. At 1 o'clock, they were ready to set up camp on the new floe and settle in for the night. Now, they left a lot of stuff behind, a lot of litter back there. And they left the boards that they had been sleeping on, that some of the men had been sleeping on, taken from the ship, so they didn't get wet. Well, the boards were there, so now they're sleeping on the snow, in their sleeping bags on the snow, and it's not pleasant. It was very wet. Some decided that they'd sleep in the boats, but they're kind of cramped and curled up, but at least it was dry. And this is one of the things, as I'm reading the book, and again, it's not really explained as much as I would like, is they were so wet most of the time, and yet they didn't freeze to death. So, in the morning, Shackleton gave Worsley a bottle with a message and sent him back to Ocean Camp. Hadn't gone that far, remember, with the team. And the note contained the coordinates of where Endurance had been crushed, where the team was now, and where they were heading, and that they were hoping to find land. It was dated December 23rd, 1915, and concluded, "All well," and signed Ernest Shackleton. It would tell what happened to the expedition in case they didn't survive, and just in case, in the minute chance that someone in the future should find it. He didn't leave it before they broke camp because he didn't want any of the men to find it and think that he, Shackleton, thought there was a possibility of them not surviving. He always wanted to maintain the optimistic outlook that they would make it back to their families. He was their leader, and while he did every single bit of physical labor that the other men did, and was truly with them in body, they managed somewhere along the line, somebody found a deck of cards that were brand spanking new. And so he took the chance and he topped the bridge. And apparently the folks who didn't get into the bridge felt quite left out, but they made that choice. But mentally, he was aloof because he was, as we know, the boss. And that's what they called him, the boss. He bore the responsibility of their being where they were and getting them out. They wouldn't have been in that situation if he hadn't had this idea to take this trek across Antarctica and then hired them. The next day, they started the slog again and ran into so much broken ice that it wasn't safe to drag the boats and the sledges. The ice pack was breaking up a little, but not enough to launch the boats. And more often than not, as soon as it opened, it just closed right back up again. Now, little detail here, but it tells what every time they move, the formation, sort of like a military. Shackleton would lead, looking for the best route, followed by the 7 sledges pulled by the dogs, a smaller sledge loaded with the blubber stove, and the cooking gear that was pulled by cook Charlie Green, and motor expert and shopkeeper Thomas Ordelise. And finally, 17 men pulled the 2 boats. The process was to pull one boat a couple hundred yards, walk back to the other one, which was on a sledge, and it was probably already frozen to the snow, so they had to hack it all out and drag it forward. And between their weight and the weight of the boats, they would sink into the soft slush with each step. It was exhausting work. And after about 5 hours, Shackleton ordered them to stop for the night. 5 hours, they got a half mile. The next day was more of the same, and however, a large floe had been spotted the day before, and they made it to it. But again, more high ridges got in their way, and they couldn't continue any further. It was cold, it was difficult work, and they were absolutely getting nowhere. And the ice itself, the mass, is moving all at the same time. McNeish, grumpy from the start of the voyage, refused an order from Worsley, arguing the contract that he signed was no longer valid since the ship had gone down. Worsley himself was not feeling all that great, so instead of handling it himself, he notified Shackleton of the concern. Shackleton very strongly told McNeish what his duty was, exerting his power as the boss, the leader of the expedition. Now, normally, McNeish would have been correct. The standard sailor contract says ship goes down, you're not bound to the contract anymore. However, Shackleton had inserted an extra paragraph binding all who sailed on Endurance to perform any duty on board, in the boats, on the shore as directed by the master and owner. And he was now defining the shore as the ice. McNeish was still unhappy, although what he thought was going to happen if he said, okay, is anybody's guess. But he had no choice, unless anyone else feel the same. The boss read the contract to the rest of the men before they went to sleep that night. He was exerting, saying, I may be with you here, I may be doing what you're doing, but you will listen to me, I'm the boss. It's like the general in a battle, you listen to the general. That night in his diary, Shackleton wrote, turned in but could not sleep, thought the whole matter over and over and decided to retreat to more secure ice. It is the only safe thing to do. Am anxious for so big a party and 2 boats in bad conditions, we could do nothing. I do not like retreating, but prudence demands this course. He ended with the following, everyone working well except the carpenter. I shall never forget him in this time of strain and stress. And as we will learn later, he could carry that grudge. They tried to find a safe flow, but everything seemed to be breaking up just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to free them. They couldn't get all the stuff back to ocean camp the way they had come because the ice had deteriorated too much. As of New Year's Eve, 1915, many of the men were starting to truly realize how perilous their situation really was. Because before they had thought their determination, their skill, what they knew, they would be able to power through this. But now they were realizing their power is nothing compared to Mother Nature's. She was so much larger than they were. And in the interconnected web of life, she was the strongest force. The wind, the currents, and the ice had conspired to stop their grand expedition and to sink their ship. And now seemed they were conspiring to prevent their salvation. They needed the ice to be strong enough to hold their weight because they were stuck on it, but they needed it to break apart enough to open up sea lanes big enough to launch the boats. Maybe Catch-22 before Catch-22 was a thing. Instead, what they got were temperatures hovering above freezing during the day, weakening the ice, and then refreezing it again at night, but never enough to be safe. The only way they were going to get out of this is if their 3 enemies cooperated some more. Now, while stuck, sea creatures are coming by, and they were able to hunt and kill 7 seals. But Shackleton ordered only 4 of them to be butchered for food. He said the rest of them wouldn't be needed. While others thought, we got them, let's be prepared. But Shackleton's mindset was if they had more, it would imply that they didn't have faith in their ability to get out of this. And in this case, his self-confidence and ego got in the way of doing what would have been prudent and gathering as much food as possible. There was no worry it was going to spoil. They were on the ice, after all. It was an interesting decision for him to make because a nickname the men had called him behind his back was Old Cautious, because he didn't believe in taking extra risk. And in my case, I can say that caution and optimism in this case made for some very odd decisions. They were stuck here at what they called Mark Time Camp, waiting for something to happen. The Green Street wrote, "The monotony of life here is getting on our nerves. Nothing to do, nowhere to walk, no change in surroundings, food, or anything. God, send up open water soon, or we shall go balmy." And then again, because of the seal thing, food started running short, and Green Street did comment that Shackleton's extreme optimism in not using all the seals for food bordered on foolishness. And then what was becoming routine, this flow started to get too dangerous. And again, they don't explain how they did it exactly, but they built a bridge of ice and snow across the flow about 150 yards away. They had been on the move for a month, yet they were still close enough for ocean camp for some of the men to go back for some of the stores left behind. By mid-January, a gale blew up from the southwest, and all they could do at this time was huddle in their tents as the 50-mile-an-hour winds with gusts up to 70 blew outside, and snow came in, and it was wet and miserable inside. This was the glass half empty part. The glass about 3/4 full, and I know that doesn't add up, but part was they were on the move. That gale had moved them. After a few days, Worsley was able to see some sun, and using his sextant, determined they had moved 73 miles north. And when the gale was finally over after 6 days, they had moved 84 miles closer to their goal. Worsley climbed a 60-foot iceberg. That may be it, I don't know. That one was give or take. And looked out to see what had happened. Had there been enough opening, or were they still just bound? And they were still bound. The sea and the movements had just moved all the flows closer together. But one good thing had happened. Things had closed up, and ocean camp was now only about 5 miles away. So after about a week after this of waiting and waiting and waiting to 12 Shackleton, a group of teams were sent back to see what supplies they could salvage. They brought back some the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which amazes me. They had that on board. And McNeish was thrilled. He was a devout Presbyterian, and he was getting a little tired of just rereading the Bible over and over because it was the only book he had. And then a couple of days later, 18 men were sent back to get the last lifeboat, the Stanhope Wills. A tremendous relief to the men, and since most of them, including Worsley, didn't think that 2 lifeboats would be enough to carry all 28 men over any distance over what surely would be rough seas. Upon their return with the 3rd lifeboat, they were greeted by meteorologists Leonard Hussey and Shackleton with some hot tea. Physicist Reginald James said it was the most welcome tea I ever had. Some fruit and veggies would have been welcome. The all-meat diet was causing some problems with their GI tracts, and they had left all the toilet paper on the Endurance. The only replacement was snow. I'll leave the rest of it to your imagination, but suffice it that they say things were not pleasant. They also had not bathed since getting off the Endurance. Hair and beards were getting long, and faces were black from the smoke from the oil used to cook. They tried once more to see what else they could salvage from ocean camp, but they couldn't get through. They could only get to within about 2 miles, but there was some open water where Worsley thought they could cross. Macklin didn't, and caution won out. But what those trips had shown is the ice was still. It has been months. It was still too packed to launch, so it was back to waiting, and the seals weren't coming in anymore. And although they had a decent supply of meat, they were running out of the blubber to cook it. So rations were cut. Fortunately for the men, the flow seemed to be in the migration path of some penguins to Paulette Island. and they were killed, and some were killed and added to the food stores. But the penguin has an interesting thing that another prior expedition had discovered. It supplies more vitamin C than the seals. So what this was doing, because they were eating this diet, they didn't get what very often happened on ships, they didn't get scurvy. So that was another thing that they avoided. Some of us here are vegetarians and vegans, and we can't imagine eating a penguin or a seal, for that matter, a cow or pig or chicken. But I would hazard a guess that the men of the Endurance would have said they wouldn't have eaten those seals and penguins either when they first set sail. And it's not like some of the critters wouldn't have returned the favor. Earlier, when moving from floe to show, a leopard seal, they called it a sea leopard, lunged at one of the men, and he ran off across the floe to jump across to the next floe. And what happened in that space between them? But the leopard seal popped up and started chasing him, baring its teeth. And it got to within about 15, 20 feet of him when one of his shipmates killed him. And that's one that came near Zodiac, and at the time the photographer, the videographer, had her leg in the water, and the call came over the radio, get your foot out of the water now. There's a leopard seal. It was nearing the end of February, and in that time, the winds had carried them another 68 miles, about 2 miles a day. But it wasn't a straight line. Let's see. Okay. It wasn't a straight line, but they were generally going the direction they wanted to go. But the boredom was felt by all, including Shackleton. But he did make a discovery. Per his tentmate James, the quote, the boss just discovered a new use for the blubber, as it is industriously cleaning the backs of our cards with it. These playing cards have got so dirty that some are almost unrecognizable. The blubber, however, cleans all of it off again. Truly, the seal is a useful beast. So it shows you how important just small things like cards were to keep them the sanity. It gave them a lot of poker. There was poker in addition to the bridge. And of course, we had the banjo from last time. But the bad weather just kept coming and coming and coming. The winds and the snow, and then sometimes sleet because it was hovering around freezing. And they were always wet. And then what happened? On March 9th, they felt something new. The ice was moving not this way, but this way, up and down, and they could hear it cracking. It was a swell from open ocean. But where was that open ocean, and how many miles away was it? Worsley went to the edge of the floe and timed the rise and the fall. And after much discussion, they decided they were about 30 miles away from open sea. So they spread, in order to not put too much weight on any spot of the floe, they spread things out. And also, so if it cracked, they wouldn't lose everything. And then what happens? The next morning, nothing. No more swells. By March 22nd, the food stores, especially the lack of blubber to cook with, were once again approaching dire. They had 10 days of food left. And then on March 23rd, on his out for his morning constitutional, Shackleton spotted something dark in the distance. He ran back to camp yelling, land in sight, land in sight. Some of the men ran out to look. Others stayed in their tents because they thought it was going to be what it had always turned out to be before, a large iceberg off in the distance. But it was land. It was Joinville Island. And Joinville's in black here because they actually landed at the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, 57 miles to their west. But there wasn't one man among them who thought the sea would open up enough for them to launch the boats. And they were surrounded by treacherous bits of floes that were always moving. Uh-oh. All right, something's wrong. Some thought they should try to get back to ocean camp again, since there was some food still there, but Shackleton deemed the ice too unstable. But Mother Nature provided and some more seals showed up. And in something that's very unpleasant, even more unpleasant to think about, he ordered the dogs to be destroyed so that they could eat the dog food. And when they got to the sea in the lifeboats, the dogs would have to be destroyed anyway because it was more humane than leaving them to fight each other alone on the floe or starve to death. At 5:30 in the morning on March 28, 1916, the floe they were on started to crack. They scrambled out of their tents and moved the boats to a more solid area. It cracked again, and the James Caird was nearly lost. But they were able to pull it over to the bigger part of the floe. They also got a leopard seal, which supplied about 2 weeks worth of blubber and food, 1,000 pounds. And they also found 50 undigested fish for a special treat they hadn't had in over a year. Then a sustained swell came and continued throughout the day, raising and lowering the floe, crashing it into the others. So they started a watch where they would have teams and they would alternate 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 24 hours a day, looking for cracks to warn people that were sleeping that they needed to get up and get going. And one of the things that happened was they had food, right? What does food do? It makes you feel better. So their moods improved, but their flow was now no more than about 200 yards or a couple of football fields across. But they were moving further and further north. And what had happened in this moving north? They had passed Paulette Island, they had passed the peninsula. And they were now hoping for Clarence Island, which again it's Mary's Arrow, so their general vicinity, and Elephant Island. That was their next spot to try for. And if they didn't make it going north and the way the sea's going straight up, there's nothing there. And due to cloud cover, they didn't know exactly where they were, but on the 5th of April, Worsley took another reading, and in spite of headwinds, they moved 21 miles west in 2 days. Now, Clarence Island was their only hope. The thing they were most worried about is that they would drift a little bit to the west and into the Drake Passage, the roughest seas on Earth. And there was no way they would survive that in their little 22-foot lifeboats. So they could see Clarence Island 52 miles away, but the ice was still too light to launch the boat. But they were surrounded by whales and seals and other seabirds, which would signal there was land, that it was open ocean nearby, having the seabirds there. It was moving rapidly, the pack was moving rapidly, and the wind changed their drift a little bit to the west, and that stopped. And then they went 8 miles north in 2 days. And then they discovered they barely moved. Now their big solid flow was a triangle, about 100 yards on, a little more lopsided, but roughly a football field long on all 3 sides. Their flow cracked in 2. Now it was 50 yards across. There were no bigger or safer flows anywhere, just smaller ones that kept crashing into each other. The pack was opening, and at 12:40 on April 6th, Shackleton gave the order to launch the boats. The Dudley Docker, the Stancomb Wills were removed from their sledges and launched, followed by the James Caird. It had taken less than an hour to pack up all the stores they could and launch the boats. The sailors were now once again at boats at sea. And when they turned and looked back, the ice began to close once again. I write this and I have these where I want to go, and then I don't get there. So I could have gone on for an hour and taken where I originally planned, but we will be back for part 3, probably in July, maybe August, and we'll see how far I can get on that one. So the next song, because we're using contemporary music, I did have a little time to do some more research as I'm preparing this, and we did find some of the songs that they listened to and they played. A couple of them were Stephen Foster, which are not UU songs. So we're going to have Carly play now It's a Long Way to Tipperary. Okay, Alan, if everybody could read with me from your program, we're going to we extinguish our chalice flame,
but not for the light of wisdom, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again.
Throughout our lives, we experience many ups and downs. Sometimes we are put in situations that are uncomfortable, maybe even dangerous. But most of us will never be in a situation as life-threatening as the men of the Endurance. At least we hope so. Behind the optimism, what I find so inspiring about this story is how it seemed to bring out the best in them. They lived in the one for all for one idea. Some have been a little more begrudging of this, but they did all perform their duties, and they knew what they needed to do to be a team, or better yet, a small community to survive. As our UUFP community binds us together as part of the larger Pottstown community, which is part of the Pennsylvania community, to the community of the United States of America, and finally to the world community. We know we are all better when we pull together as a team. So thank you, shalom, namaste, gracias, and may it be so.